presentation is going to be on the topical area of the different education levels that exist in Ontario's formal education system. We will address all the levels, but we'll be focusing more on the elementary through post-secondary and some of the alternatives and sub-areas of some of these levels of education. And we will focus at these levels with the intersection of immigration status and how that affects enrollment eligibility. My name is Stefan. I'm the Youth and Access to Education Coordinator at the FCJ Refugee Center. And this presentation is possible thanks to the support of Maytree, who's the funder for the majority of our Access to Education programming. Okay, like I mentioned, if you have any questions as I go over the sections, feel free to put it in the chat. I will stop to check in on questions at certain points during the presentation. But we will also have a question and answer period at the end. This session is being recorded. Any portions that involve components from participant interaction will be edited out before we upload it onto our website. So you can keep that in mind if you would like to share as well, just to maintain the privacy of all participants in this session. Okay, with that, let's get to our land acknowledgement. The land that our center, FCJ Refugee Center, is located on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Now, this is a acknowledgement that we read during our presentations to acknowledge the land that we are on, but I also encourage you to learn about the lands that you are on, where you live, where you gather for work, community gathering, and so on and so forth. And if you would like a resource, you can use nativeland.ca. And if you do come from lands that are outside of Canada, I encourage you to try and learn about the history of the lands and your own culture as well. For me, learning about land acknowledgements and Indigenous nations when I first came to Canada was a new experience for me. So I encourage you to do the same and put some actionable efforts towards some of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions. Let's take a look at our overview for today. I mentioned it in the beginning what today's session is going to be about. We just completed the land acknowledgement. We'll learn a little bit about our center and what services we provide and how you can make use of some of the resources that we have as well. We'll talk about precarious status, some of the implications that has when it comes to education. We'll talk about the general education system in Canada, focusing on Ontario, and we'll see why when we get to that slide as well. The Ministry of Education, and particularly Memorandum SB 16 and some of the major changes and some of the rollout of those changes or existing legislation and regulations. And then we'll talk about secondary and tertiary. Tertiary just means post-secondary. Sometimes it's things that are after secondary education, but not particularly at college or university, of anything that's 18 plus education and what that access looks like. So who are we as a center? FCJ Refugee Center is a nonprofit organization. We've been working with folks with precarious immigration situations and folks who are at risk due to their immigration status for more than 34 years now. We welcome anyone asking information, seeking counsel regarding the issues of their immigration status in itself or immigration status in conjunction with different areas. We provide a broad range of wraparound service delivery supports that you'll see in our next slides. And we particularly work with folks that fit within the umbrella of precarious migrants. And I'll explain what some of those statuses mean and what some of those statuses are in an upcoming slide. This is the broad range of services and resources that we have as a center. We have the settlement and integration program, which this presentation under the access to education area is being provided by. You see the list of all the other programs in the first column. The second column is our immigration support program, the different services and applications we're able to support with and provide information regarding. We have the anti-human trafficking program that falls under the settlement and integration area, but they have some distinct programs and services that are listed out in this third column. And then the public education and networking area. So once we finish today's webinar, it'll be uploaded on our website and it'll be part of the digital resources that you can access, not just right now while it is live, but also in the future as well. So that's one of the examples of what falls under that area of our services. And then the final column is our contact over regular phone call, WhatsApp, the general email address, our website, and then our social media platforms. Okay, so I said I'll explain what's the difference between some of the precarious statuses that we work with, folks who have those statuses, and this term that you might or might not have heard, which is regularized status. So, in general consensus, regularized status is something that is either permanently there or something that is in the process of being permanent for someone regarding their permanency in Canada, while precarious is something which is not fully finalized or might still be in the process of getting a final decision whether or not that person's status gets finalized in Canada. So with the regularized status, the most highest one that you can have is Canadian citizenship. For folks who are sole Canadian citizens, it's a little more guaranteed than when you're a dual Canadian citizen. Then you have permanent residence. So this comes with most of the supports and allowances as a Canadian citizen. You just need to maintain the regulations of your permanent residency, and also you're not able to participate in things like voting in Canadian elections. Then you have convention refugees or protected persons. Essentially, both of these titles mean someone who's gone through the due process of the refugee determination system and have received a positive decision. A convention refugees title is based on the Geneva Convention and the UN Convention, and a protected person is someone who is seeking protection in terms of threats to their life. So that's why the two distinctions in title is received after the refugee determination process, but essentially both of them are approved refugees. Then you have international student and visitor. You'll see there's an asterisk next to both of those titles. And that's because depending on where someone is in their process or where regulations stand in the immigration system at any given point in time, these folks can fall under regularized or they can fall under precarious. And then coming to the precarious column of statuses, you have refugee claimants. So these are folks who've initiated a refugee claim, but are still waiting for their due process to be completed. So there's no final decision, or they might be waiting for a long period of time to get a date to even have a decision. So that entire period, you're left in this state of, will there be a positive decision? Will there not be a positive decision? Then you have folks who've had their decision, but it's a negative outcome, so refused refugee claimants. And then folks will have to wait out the due process on what next steps might exist. So precarious during that entire time. Again, international student and visitor for the reasons I explained previously. And then you have those caught in limbo due to immigration policy changes. You might or might not be aware, but whenever there are immigration policy changes, very seldom does it take into account where people came under previous regulations and were hoping to have those regulations throughout their process. So sometimes when rules change or policies change and they're not applied um, to folks coming in only in the future, but also apply to folks who are already here, then that creates issues for folks and leaves them with precarious situations. Victims and survivors of human trafficking. We will talk about some of the permits that folks get when they are victims of human trafficking. You have things that are open work permits for vulnerable workers if it was a labor trafficking situation. You also have temporary resident permit holders, so TRPs, not temporary residents or temporary resident visas, which are different. Visitor records, which is also different. Those don't fall under this status. You also have folks involved in sponsorship breakdowns, whether it's a partner sponsorship or whether it was a parental sponsorship. And then you have anyone without official immigration status living in Canada. So you might have heard terms like non-status, undocumented. So these are different ways of folks without official immigration status living in Canada are described with. So hope this gives a good understanding of the difference between regularized and precarious. And we do work with some folks who have regularized status, but our major focus is with folks who have precarious status in Canada. Okay, so you've understood some of the statuses now. And also that's not an exhaustive list. There are other different immigration statuses. That's just to give you an idea of the majority of ones that we work with. Now let's learn a little bit about the the education system in Canada, and we'll focus in on Ontario, and you'll come to learn why. So in Canada, education is administered provincially, which means each province and territory has their own system of how education is rolled out. Most of them have their own ministries, and each of them have their own regulations, curriculum, and governing bodies. In Ontario, we have two ministries that focus on education. Uh, the levels of education that are governed in Ontario can be divided into preschool, daycare, elementary, secondary, and post-secondary. The first three fall under the Ministry of Education, and it's responsible for government policy, funding, curriculum planning, and direction in all levels of public education, and this includes elementary and secondary schools. And it focuses on the public system. So we'll learn a little bit more about the four different boards that fall under the public system, but this is sole purpose to the public system. If a private system uh, is looking to be accredited, then there's some due process they need to follow in terms of being regulated and checked in by the ministry, but in general, this covers the public system. And the current Minister of Education in the province of Ontario is Paul Kallikaden. And then when you go to the higher level, which is the fourth option on the levels of education, you have the Ministry of Colleges and Universities until 2025. Now the name has been changed. The Ministry of Colleges, Universities, Research Excellence, and Security. So this ministry is responsible for administration of laws relating to post-secondary education, and the current Minister of Colleges, Universities, Research Excellence and Security is Nolan Quinn. And just as a reiteration, because each province has their own rules, for the scope of this webinar, we will be only speaking about the Ontario education system. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the other systems, we can come to Q&A period and I can share some resources, but for the purpose and the scope of what our center can speak to, we will be just speaking about Ontario. Okay, so what does the education system, elementary and secondary levels look like when the student or the prospective student is under age 18? Firstly, let's talk about the public school system and the four publicly funded boards which fall under the scope of regulation of the Ministry of Education. You have the English language public school system, French language public school system, English language separate school system, and then the French language separate school system. Essentially, all four of these are public school systems, but the first two are general public systems, and the second two are public school systems that have an additional component. So you might have heard the terms public school or Catholic school. Which one does a child want to go to? Or which one does the parent want to pick for their child? So the public system would be the general public system, and the Catholic school board would be the separate school system. So it has that additional component of religion there. And you have these options with the English and French language boards. We will focus a little bit more on the English language boards because some of the regulations and rules under the Education Act that need to be followed for the French language systems are outside of the scope of what we provide on a regular basis. But again, if you have questions and would like more resources or to be connected to resources regarding the French language school boards, you can let us know in the chat or the Q&A portion, and we will share those resources as well. Okay, so we spoke about the different school board systems. Now that we're talking about the English school boards in the Greater Toronto area, these are the 5 different school boards. The Toronto region, York region, Halton region, Peel region, and Durham region, each of them having both the general public system and the Catholic public systems. These are a list of all of the acronyms, and then in the parentheses, they're spelled out so you know what each of the alphabets mean in those acronyms. But if you have a child who's in school, or if you already have a knowledge of the system coming into this webinar, you will be familiar with at least one or two of these acronyms, but they're there just as an additional resource. Okay, now coming on to after all of this information about precarious status, the different school boards, how the system works in Ontario and in Canada, who is considered fee exempt or who can go to school without needing to pay fees, who is considered international, what does it mean to be an international student, and what are some of the requirements for all of this for the kids to be able to go to school. We'll be talking about that as we go along, but I just want to mention as a disclaimer, we will be talking about some of the statuses that we as a center work with more frequently. So it's not an exhaustive list again. There are other statuses that fall under either category outside of the newcomer population. But for the scope of today, we'll be talking about newcomer and precarious statuses. Okay, so you might have seen many of these when I did regularized versus precarious status, but here we will be focusing on the terms domestic, which means folks that are seen as fee exempt, and international for folks that are seen as fee paying students. So most immigration statuses in the Ontario system for under age 18 education are seen as domestic students. So you have Canadian citizens, permanent residents, convention refugees or protected persons, refugee claimants, rejected refugee claimants, folks who are non-status, a minor child of an international student, minor child of a work permit holder, a person who has a temporary resident permit, or a dependent of a parent with a temporary resident permit. And again, this is not a temporary resident visa or a temporary resident itself, which you'll see as visitor or tourist on the right hand side. This is someone who is given a permit and given a fixed allowed amount of time to stay in Canada for a particular reason. And the most times that we as a center see someone with a temporary resident permit, they're a victim or survivor of human trafficking. And then the last option on that column is someone awaiting a decision on their permanent residence, usually through the humanitarian compassionate grounds application process or through a sponsorship or family reunification process. On the right hand side, Someone who's considered international or a fee-paying student is a visitor or tourist who's in Canada less than 6 months. So they're still on the tourist phase unless it has been explicitly mentioned during that time of entry an allowed period to stay. So for example, if someone entered Canada today, which is the 28th of October, and they were given just 24 hours in the country, they would have to leave by October 29th within that 24-hour period. If they were given 3 weeks, then they have 3 weeks. So these dates will be stamped and they'll be given a letter, which is generally a visitor record, stating the date that they have to leave before. Uh, if they don't have something given as such, it's generally taken as 6 months. Sometimes, in rare circumstances or based on the situation of entry to Canada, someone might get that same stamp, but more than 6 months. So, depending on what allowance was given at the time of entry, that's how much stay someone will have. If nothing was given, it's 6 months. So, that's how you can consider visitor tourist status. And then a foreign national who's outside Canada who wants to come to Canada for the purpose of an Ontario education, and they apply as an international student, get a study permit, they would be considered international fee-paying students. So we will be talking about some of the domestic statuses and the changes as we go along the slides. But in general, to be able to access elementary and secondary education, if there's a school-age child who arrived in Canada as a visitor, they need to wait 6 months before entering school, and the 6 months is should they lose their status. Then it's 6 months plus a day or whatever the visitor status allowance was. We'll talk a little bit more about this in an upcoming slide. But if their status changes from visitor, it could change their eligibility to go to school. If there's a school-age child, they made a refugee claim at a port of entry, and they got their letter of acknowledgement of claim or refugee protection claimant document, now called refugee protection identity document. Then they have a valid documentation that they can use as their status document to enter school. But if they made an inland refugee claim, so after they've been processed past the entry point, then they would need to wait to get their refugee documentation before they can apply to go to school. And if they're a school-age child with parents who have a valid study or work permit before the child is enrolled in school, they have the same fee exemption as domestic students. So these are just some of the previous slide details spelled out. Okay, so you know what are the statuses, what's considered domestic, what's considered international. Now, what is needed in terms of documentation for an enrollment? First, you need the passports. So you'll need the passport of the parent who are in Canada and children. You would need a birth certificate for the children. And if it's Catholic school and it's Catholic elementary, so under age 14, you would need a baptismal certificate for either the child or the parent in a Catholic church. It can be a Catholic church anywhere around the world, but it has to be a Catholic church. If it's a Catholic school but secondary, so anything above age 14, they don't require a baptismal certificate. Just the child, parent, family needs to be aware that they will be receiving a Catholic education. So just keep that in consideration if that is something to take into account in the decision making process. In terms of address proof, I know this can be a little tricky because some folks might not have all these documents or might not even have two of these documents. Different proof of address is needed. It can be a rental agreement, a utility bill. So this can be Enbridge, Enercare, your hydro bill, electricity bill, home internet, landline phone bills. No mobile phones are accepted. No bank accounts are accepted. No Ontario IDs are accepted. You can use your taxes, so your notice of assessment, And any letter from a government agency can be used as proof. So if someone's a refugee claimant and they're receiving Ontario Works or social assistance, or Ontario Disability Support Program benefits, then those can be also used as proof of address. Now, however, if you don't have any of these proofs of address, or if you don't have two proofs of these address, but you're staying at an address that's being shared with a family member or someone who does have this proof of address, they will need to give two documents in their name along with the letter of explanation saying that so and so is living with me. So you can name the parents, you can name the children in that letter, and then have the two proof of address as supporting documents. Now, with folks who are in the refugee determination process, you would need your status documents. This is for the parents and children. So it could be a letter of acknowledgement of claim. If you made a refugee claim in the past, it could be a refugee protection claimant document, RPCD, also called the brown paper. But now that same document has been named as RPID, Refugee Protection Identity Document. So you can use that, or the acknowledgement of claim, which is also colloquially called the white paper. And if, let me just quickly backtrack to the refugee status document. So if you've had a positive decision, or even if you've had a negative decision on the refugee claim, you will receive a document called notice of decision. So that can be also used for enrollment in schools. Some boards are not familiar with that document, so you might need to advocate and explain what that is. And if you need the support of our center or another community organization, please do reach out for support with advocacy there. For folks who don't have official immigration status, we'll talk about this when we look at SB 16, but entry stamps, plane tickets, or boarding passes can be used to prove the day you entered Canada. Some of these documents, like a boarding pass, not all of them have the year on the document, but you can always contact the airline and get those details. But if that is difficult, or if that's a point of concern, you can also look in your emails for the plane tickets or the plane itinerary, and that will have the information of those who are boarding the plane and the details of departure and arrival as well. Entry stamps, not everyone has on their passport, so school shouldn't give you too much hassle for this. But again, if they do, we will talk about the ministry memorandum SB 16 and how that explicitly says that there's no one particular documentation that proves uh, immigration status or lack of immigration status, I should say. But we'll come to that in a few moments. And then finally, if someone's in a study or work permit holder category, you'll have those immigration documents for the parents. In circumstances like this, most times, if not always, the kids will have a visitor record, but they are being enrolled under the parents' status. So the visitor record shouldn't be an issue, but if that's again pushback area from school boards, you can explain that they're being enrolled under the parents status, and this is allowed under the regulations of both the ministry memorandum and the Education Act, but also particularly the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the IRPA. That's where all of these things are being referred back to. Okay, so I've been saying Ministry of Education memorandum. I've been saying the number SB 16. So now we finally come to this document. Prior to this, there was a document called SB 08, SB 08, and now this has clarified some of the information from SB 08, and it has included some changes as well. So there were some regulations that existed, they were not being applied in full force. There were some regulations that existed that have been reclarified a little bit. So we look at that document and we'll see what some of those changes are, and hopefully that addresses some of the questions that folks were interested in learning about from today's webinar. Okay, I'm going to switch the sharing of my screen. And just as I was switching the sharing, it showed me a different PowerPoint screen. So I hope folks were able to follow along as I was going along with the slides. Okay, so now we should be looking at the memorandum document pulled up. And don't worry if you're concerned that you might not be able to find this document. It is hyperlinked into the title on that slide. So when that's uploaded with the webinar, you'll be able to access this. But if you want to search it up or pull it up on your side, you can search Ministry of Education 2024 SB16. But when you put Ministry of Education, just include Ontario there as well, because other ministries might also have their own memorandums in different provinces. So this is from August 28th, 2024, before the previous school year started. There hasn't been an update to this particular memorandum, but we project to see some changes coming soon. Because as organizations working on advocacy in this sector, we have already been discussing some of these topical areas. So the first one, the first section just explains what this memorandum is. It's a follow-up to SB08, and any section that is in bold letters are the new changes and updates. So it's easy to identify in this document. In the general section, it's talking about the Ontario student record, what's allowed to be requested in terms of personal information, and what's expected of the school board staff. They're expected to review it and give it back to the parent or guardian immediately. They're not uh, allowed to retain your documents or do things outside of the scope of what they're allowed to review eligibility for enrollment. So that's what that first section is talking about. And there are hyperlinks to some of the ministry enrollment register instructions and how they're supposed to go about in terms of reviewing and storing your information. The second section is in terms of residency. So this is what I was talking about in terms of what documents are allowed for proving your address and where you're residing. And here, this is the section that explains that landline is what's required, not a mobile phone. That's what they accepting, and this is more in terms of when the ministry audits the school boards, what is allowed for fee exemption. So here again, they say an Ontario's driver's license, which also includes an Ontario photo ID, the purple card, the blue card, both are not acceptable forms of documentation to confirm residence. Now, one thing this section clarifies in the footnotes, anywhere in this memorandum where it says parent, it means parent or someone who has lawful custody of the student. And like I mentioned earlier, this entire paragraph section is talking about if you don't have those documents with the parent's name on them. So if the parent's not on the rental agreement, they're not on the utility bill, family or a friend who they're staying with, wherever you're residing, the person who does have those documents can provide that proof for you. So that's what that bold section clarifies. In terms of guardianship, this is something that is become a little tricky for folks unless all of these bullet point conditions are being met. Um, then unfortunately, what this regulation currently spells out is an Ontario court order transferring custody from parents to the adult resident within Ontario is required for guardianship to be considered. A notarized document in lieu of the Ontario court order is no longer being considered as sufficient. So that is an issue if the parents are not physically in Ontario as well. Now, in terms of tuition exemption, these sections, when they say 49.7, you'll see 49.6 also perhaps. They're talking about subsections of the Ontario Education Act, and in the Ontario Education Act, those sections have bullet points 1, 2, 3, and those refer back to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the IRPA. So that's why we see some of the statuses like a temporary resident permit holder also being considered in allowances for fee exemption. So this first section is in respect to adult learners. So if the person is above 18, they are evaluated based on their own qualifications. If they are considered under lawful custody of a parent, they might qualify for those exemptions, and that needs to be determined by the school board in terms of lawful custody arrangement. So those would require additional documentation. This is talking about admission decisions and best practices for school boards to follow. So not necessarily for parents and the prospective students to have in mind, but it's good to be knowledgeable of what's in these documents and where you can go for further information. Now, for status, folks who are applicants for permanent residence. So this is someone who is, the first option talks about if the person or the applicant is someone who's in the process of applying for Canadian citizenship and their parent or someone with lawful custody is already a Canadian citizen. That's one condition. The other one is if the person or parent is here in Canada and they are a permanent resident and or they're waiting for determination on the application for permanent residency. Now, with this, if it's the first one, they were in determination for their citizenship, that evidence that the parent is a Canadian citizen needs to be provided. If the parent is a permanent resident and awaiting the determination on the application for permanent residence in Canada, they would need to provide that proof to the school board. Now with this, most cases, like I mentioned earlier, is through the humanitarian and compassionate grounds process. So the document that school boards are expected to review is the approval in principle letter. Formerly, this document was called the stage 1 letter. And this generally says that the applicant has met most of the eligibility requirements. They have to follow up on few more steps before their permanent residence. So that's one. But in some cases, the school boards may accept alternative evidence to the claim that the applicant is awaiting determination for their permanent residence. So this could be if the parent is a citizen or the parent is married to a citizen or permanent residents in Canada who resides in Ontario, and they might not have the approval in principle letter yet. So it depends on a case by case nature, but generally there are allowances for folks in the PR determination process. Now, someone might be waiting for their permanent residence, but they might have had a status prior to that that is an eligible status. For example, someone who's a refugee, protected person or convention refugee, that is an eligible status to go to school. So you don't have to wait for the PR to be able to apply. So you'll see the nuances and the changes that vary based on the individual immigration status. Now, the next category is children of full-time Ontario post-secondary students. I won't go into too much detail on this slide. You can see all the requirements that the parents need to meet under their study permit, but they have to be a full-time pupil, and then all the other conditions need to be met. Then their child is able to go to school as a dependent of the study permit holder. Then you have students who are claiming refugee status. So if they're under 18 and they have one of the refugee process documentations, that's sufficient to apply for the fee exemption access to school. In this document, they have mentioned the wrong department of the Canadian immigration system. It's generally IRCC, Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada, or the IRB, Immigration Refugee Board, that issues documentation for folks. So it's not Canada Border Services Agency, but that shouldn't be an issue. And also, since this document has been issued, the RPCD, Refugee Protection Claimant Document, has been renamed to the Refugee Protection Identity Document. So just keep that in mind. If there's ever pushback, that's the explanation for that. Applicants for a work permit. So if someone has a work permit, their work permit's coming up on expiry, and if they've applied for an extension, or if they don't have the work permit yet, but they have a job offer from an eligible employer and a positive labor market impact assessment, LMIA, has gone through, those are other ways that proof can be shown for kids of a work permit holder or a work permit awaiting determination holder to be fee exempt access to school while they're under age 18. And then the last category for this document that we'll go a little into detail is folks who are unlawfully in Canada. And we'll talk about section 49.1 when we come back to the slideshow. But this document has, unfortunately, it's clarified it, but it's unfortunate for folks in many circumstances, especially folks who are in mixed status families. But it spells out that the folks who are unlawfully in Canada, um, they're the ones, the students need to be unlawfully in Canada for them to be fee exempt. So they cannot go to school if the parent has been here unlawfully for a while and the child still has a temporary status. That's not a temporary resident permit. Um, it complicates the access to school here, but this document has made it a little difficult for advocacy to go through because it has spelled out some of these details. But yeah, if someone finds themselves in a situation of precarious immigration status, you don't know where you exactly fall, feel free to reach out to us. We can help clarify your circumstances and situation, see what alternatives might exist in the meantime, and provide support along your journey in terms of accessing education. So we went over the major categories, but there are some other exemptions from time to time based on global situations and other things that are taken into consideration. The Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada may make regulations, or even the Minister of Education, depending on whose scope it falls under, for these things to be changed. Usually it's the Minister of Education. Some additional fee exemption categories for non-permanent residents may be added. And right now the existing ones can be found at this link. And this last page is not relevant to most folks, but you can go over it. It's all in the same document. And now we will switch back to our slideshow. Okay, so we've gone over all of the stuff of under age 18 education. Section 49.1 talks about folks who don't have lawful immigration status and their access to school under age 18. So a person who is otherwise entitled to be admitted to a school and who is less than 18 years of age shall not be refused admission because the person or person's parent or guardian is unlawfully in Canada. So this is what section 49.1 says, but the memorandum has clarified some things slightly different to this. So there is some room for advocacy, but also the memorandum blocks a lot of those advocacy routes. But just keep this section in mind if you're ever in a circumstance of lack of immigration status, then this is the document or the subsection which will be useful for you. Okay. So if you have any questions, I would say let's put it in the chat for now because we are a little short on time. But I will go through the next section quickly and then we can address some of those things. Okay, so we are now moving into the section and I saw a question in the chat and I think this will answer that for you. We will be touching on the section of secondary but over 18 education. Now, we will talk about two different options, but it really depends on where the individual sees themselves long term. And what I always suggest to adolescent teens and folks who are closer to their 20s, so outside of the scope of going to high school, so 18 plus, is to think what you want to be doing long term, and consider few factors. So one, does it need an education? Like, do you need to go to college or university to be able to be doing that? Or do you just need the high school completion? Do you even need the high school completion in the Ontario system? So find out those details before you invest both money and time into something that you might not need. Then work backwards. So if it's something that does need an education, fine. Now, is that education needed at just university level? Is it needed at just collegiate level? Is it needed at both university? Is it offered at both college and university? Can you take it at college for a reduced tuition rate? Or is it something you can do at technical school or in an apprenticeship program? So these are different things you take into consideration before you choose your post-secondary options. And now, once you figure that out, does this post-secondary option need certain high school credits? Does it need completion of an Ontario secondary school diploma? Can you do a credential recognition process for credentials from a country of origin? So previous education learning systems. So these are things that you would take into consideration before seeing what the options are in the first place. But for the sake of understanding, let's go over what those options are. So the first one is you have secondary school age 18 plus, and because we focus a lot on the Toronto District School Board, I'll be giving you the options from there. But what you can do is you can look for adult education at any of the school boards that I listed in the previous slide. Or if you live in a region that's outside the GTA, you can look for adult school programs in the school board that's in your home region. So at the TDSB, there are two levels of programming. Most school boards have something like this. At the TDSB, 18 to 20-year-olds can go to the advanced program, and this is just focused on getting an Ontario secondary school diploma. And folks 21 plus can go to the regular adult school program, and you have two options. You can get your Ontario secondary school diploma, or you can take a specialized program. So that can be something like a personal support worker, introduction to healthcare, hairstyling, um, early childhood education, childcare assistant. These are some of the programs that are offered. Each adult school has their different roster of programs and how they work, but generally this is something that folks have access to. Now, this doesn't come without a requirement. To be able to access these programs, a valid immigration status is needed to enroll. Um, and this is because the age of 18 and above is not covered under the Education Act. So all those allowances I explained for under 18 education, they don't apply to students that fit uh, in the age range 18 and above. So to be able to go to any of these programs, you do need valid immigration status. We'll talk about the options that exist for folks without status in a little bit. So at the TDSB, there are only 5 adult schools, and these are for in-person, synchronous, daytime schools. You have night school options. You have remote asynchronous learning options. So you pick the ones that work best for you, but that would be under the general scope of the adult schools. Now, if these are the options that you choose, regular daytime adult schools, they offer in 4 quads. So each quad is approximately 2 months, and they run from September until June. If you would like to get enrolled in the upcoming quad 2, there are some spots, some are closed, some are filling up quickly, but classes start November 11th. The next intake period will be in early January is when the registration should open, and you would have an assessment test and then an enrollment placement. So if you have valid immigration status above age 18, you can go to adult school, get your Ontario Secondary School diploma. Most of the adult schools don't require a particular English level, but some places do, and it's because they don't have ESL classes or there's a language requirement to be able to take the classes because additional language supports are not provided. Then the benefit of continuing education programs are you can get your secondary school diploma while improving your English, and it increases your opportunities and prospects of accessing post-secondary education and employability. One example I can give you is recently the province has made some changes for folks who are pursuing career in the medical field. So if 2 years of Ontario high school education is not in their past educational history, then their chances of choosing and matching into a medical program of their choice are limited. They get to take it in a future round once spots have already been filled. So it reduces chances. So that's one example of how this increases employability and access to post-secondary education. And then the last bullet point is in terms of registration periods, which I just mentioned. Okay, so getting your Ontario Secondary School diploma, what needs to be done? Uh, so for most folks now who haven't started grade 9 in 2023 or prior years, uh, it's the second section, the one here. So you'll need 17 compulsory credits. Those compulsory credits are hyperlinked here on screen. 13 optional credits. You need to meet the literacy requirement and take at least 2 online learning credits. And whichever year grade 9 was started in, it doesn't matter. 40 hours of community involvement activities or volunteering is required to meet the passing benchmark for your Ontario Secondary School diploma. So skip through this slide, but you have this as supports for like additional resources. Again, I'll skip over this section for the questions. You can put it in the chat. We have around 7 to 8 minutes left, so I will skip over to the sections of the slide, but do put your questions in the chat. I'll take a quick look before I power through to the next section. Okay, perfect. So I hope I answered the question that was in the chat while I was going over the slides, but if I didn't, at the end I can take that question and answer it as well. Okay, so post-secondary and beyond, what does this look like? Some history of this program that I'm going to talk about. It was initially the FCJ York program. After the Pan Am Games in Toronto in 2015, there was a community legacy initiative fund, and there was call for proposals. FCJ Refugee Center put in an application alongside York University, and this was for an access program. And from that funding cycle, the project had 2 pathways, a bridging program and a direct entry program for university access. And this was for folks with precarious immigration situations. So the bridging course is for folks who have been out of school for a long time. It's in the topical area of critical approaches to migration and uprootedness. It's under the area of sociology. There's no fees to this. It's 1 semester for 2 hours a week in campus, once a week classes at York University. And it started in winter 2017 and it continues until now. It's usually offered once a year, sometimes twice a year. And now this bridging course is being offered in collaboration with another Sanctuary Scholar program at Toronto Metropolitan University. So half the semester is on the York campus, half is on the TMU campus. So students or prospective future students are exposed to both campuses and they can get an idea of what their future in post-secondary education can look like. The direct entry program is for folks who do have their high school credentials and they have all the academic requirements to get into school, and they're able to take majority of the programs at York and Toronto Metropolitan University. When this was designed at York, some programs, like example, the Schulich Business School and the nursing program, were programs that were not full access for all students because there are things like medical tests that need to be done, police verifications, and the requirement for a social insurance number or a co-op work permit for mandatory placements that could not be circumvented with other activities. Now, some students who are with precarious status might be able to get all these things, but that's not a possibility for all students that are able to access this program. So that's the direct entry. And if you want more information, these hyperlinks, I believe, should take you to either the website or the email address for the program coordinator. I think it's the email address. Her name is Tanya Aberman. When this was a project between FCJ Refugee Center and York University with the funding from the City of Toronto. She used to work at FCJ, so she's familiar with the different nuances of immigration status. When you do reach out to her, she'll be your point of contact for in-campus discussions and figuring out navigating applications and different processes as a sanctuary student. Any decision should be taken in consultation with her because she'll be able to advise appropriately. She's the only one who'll be cognizant of your circumstances. The office admin staff will know you're a sanctuary student because how this program works is, yes, you do pay fees, but you pay fees at the domestic tuition rates, and the university absorbs the difference. So you will get an admissions letter that has international tuition fee rates, but you do pay domestic, and the rest is taken care of by the admin department. That's why they need to know you're a sanctuary student, but classmates, teachers, and other folks on campus won't know your immigration status unless you decide to disclose, which we suggest against because, as well meaning as someone might be, we don't want them using your immigration status against you. Both colleges, both universities have their access programs. Their websites explain it. Some of the programs they offer are slightly different depending on the university, but these questions can be flushed out by speaking to Tanya. And with the slip of the tongue there, I said colleges, but right now no colleges offer any of these access programs, unfortunately. York University and Toronto Metropolitan University are the two that offer broad range access programs. We've heard of a case that was at Queen's University where someone was offered based on their circumstances and access opportunity. We haven't had too much details outside of that from Queen's University. Wilfrid Laurier University has a partnership with Compass Refugee Center in Kitchener, and they offer 2 spots for refugee claimant students. And how that works is if Compass can make up half the tuition, the university will take care of the rest. But if they don't have any donations or funding into that program, then no students can make use of that collaboration that does exist. And with the University of Toronto, there were talks of an access program being started, but there's no public knowledge on that yet. So we're not very familiar of if that conversation has gone any further than the discussion that happened a couple of years ago. And yes, no colleges have taken on access programs yet. So unfortunately, right now, the best bet is the two universities, and the downside being that on-campus education is a requirement of the program. So proximity to Toronto, the downtown, or uh, North York alongside Line 1 is something that's a requirement to uh, make the university education experience a realistic possibility. Now, for folks who do have status, you'll go through the Ontario University's application center, but these are generally the two platforms that domestic students would use. We won't go into too much detail on that right now because that's something that most folks won't be able to utilize. And OSAP. So you might have heard this term. On it stands for Ontario Student Assistance Program. I want to just clarify for folks that might have heard about this and that any misinformation that might exist. OSAP is only eligible for certain immigration statuses. Right now, it's citizens, permanent residents, and protected persons or convention refugees, so approved refugees. So anyone outside that scope with precarious immigration status will not be able to apply for OSAP. OSAP is basically provincial funding that's offered in two categories: grants, which is money that you don't have to pay back, and student loans. Um, so this is you take the loan, use it for school, and then you have to pay it back. OSAP can help pay for things like tuition, books, equipment, fees charged by school, living expenses for full-time students only, and childcare for full-time and part-time students with children. So this is just a general picture of what OSAP is. OSAP covers educational experiences both in Ontario and Ontario residents studying in different provinces as well. So that's just to give you an overview. That's a little bit general, but for most folks um, who are attending this webinar or listening to this for the information of folks with precarious statuses, this section is not applicable to you. It's just to clarify any misinformation that might exist there. Okay, with that, we're coming to the end of our presentation, just talking about current advocacy efforts that our center is engaged in. We had a report card project that was done by the FCJ Youth Network in 2016. Over the past couple of years, our Access to Education team, alongside the Youth Network and consultative committee, had been working on a two-phase update to that. We worked on the same 5 salient areas. We produced a report in June 2024 that saw the differences and the changes between 2016 and now, almost 10 years later. And then between 2024 and 2025, we saw how much of the suggestions and areas for improvement and enhanced um, implementation were actually put into effect, and what were some resources and supports that we found out that did exist in community that was successful, and what next steps could be done. That focused on all the 3 areas: elementary, secondary, and post-secondary. And we recently did a roundtable on education access 18 plus, both secondary and post-secondary in Ontario. And that's in process of being compiled and being sent off to the relative respective stakeholders. So this is some of the advocacy we're doing in the background, just so folks are aware. We do support with frontline day-to-day enrollment access needs, but we're also trying to do some systems change. So hopefully in a couple of, like maybe a year from now, but that might be a little too ambitious, but a few years down the line, many of these changes that are negatively impacting folks with precarious immigration status and folks in general in Ontario will be some of the things that we don't have to experience anymore. But with that, thank you for coming to today's webinar. We are happy to have shared this information and hope you've learned something new, and hope to have answered some of the questions that you've had in your mind. And feel free to share this webinar with folks that you think might make use of this, or that this information might be useful for once it's up on our website. And with that, it has been a pleasure hosting this webinar for you. If you do have any questions, we can take them. I can stay on maybe for another 5 more minutes if there are any quick questions. If not, we are good to conclude.